In today's story, Helen Carter, a respected federal judge, is wrongfully arrested at the airport while traveling with her two grandchildren accused of kidnapping them. What follows is a gripping legal battle, exposing the racial profiling and injustice she endures. As the case gains national attention, Helen must fight to clear her name and seek accountability. But how far will she go to ensure justice is served? Don't miss this powerful story of resilience. Subscribe for more and let us know in the comments. What would you do in Helen's shoes? Stay tuned. The full story is just beginning. Helen Carter stood in line at the airport, holding the hands of her two young grandchildren, Sarah and James. At 62, Helen was still sharp, composed, and always one step ahead of the world around her. The towering terminals, bustling travelers, and intercom announcements were familiar distractions. But today, they were background noise to her excited grandchildren. They had been planning this vacation for months, a much-needed getaway to the Caribbean, where the sun, sand, and ocean promised a break from Helen's demanding career as a federal judge. Sarah, 8 years old, swung her small, colorful suitcase with excitement, her bright eyes scanning the nearby gates. "Grandma, do you think, see dolphins? I read that the Caribbean has dolphins." Helen smiled softly, adjusting her sunglasses perched atop her short, graying hair. "I wouldn't be surprised, sweetheart. Maybe we'll even swim with them if we're lucky." "Can we swim right when we get there?" asked James, who was 10, more reserved than his younger sister, but equally excited. His big brown eyes were wide as he looked around the busy airport, though he kept his serious expression. "We'll see, James," Helen replied, squeezing his hand gently. "First, need to get to our hotel, unpack, and then we can jump in the water. I promise." Helen looked down at her grandchildren and felt her heart swell with pride. It had been a long time since she'd had the opportunity to spend more than just a weekend with them. Her daughter Rachel had a busy schedule of her own, juggling a high-pressure job in New York City, leaving Helen with only brief moments of family time. This vacation was Helen's chance to reconnect, to show Sarah and James the wonders of the world outside the confines of a city and the expectations of their busy lives. Helen had been through countless trials and court cases during her long career, but being a grandmother brought her a different kind of fulfillment, one that no courtroom victory could match. The laughter, curiosity, and joy that came from Sarah and James were a reminder of what truly mattered. She had promised herself that this vacation would be perfect. No stress, no work calls, just quality time with the two people she loved most. As they approached the check-in counter, Helen felt a slight tug at her sleeve. Sarah was looking up at her with wide eyes. "What's the first thing we'll do when we get to the hotel?" Helen knelt down to Sarah's level, her kind but authoritative demeanor still present. "First thing I think, unpack quickly, then get changed into our swimsuits. How does that sound?" Sarah clapped her hands excitedly. "Yes, swimming first, and then ice cream." "And then ice cream," Helen confirmed, standing up as she felt James tugging lightly on her other hand. James, ever the logical one, raised a practical question. "What if we get lost? I heard airports are really big. What if we miss our flight?" Helen chuckled softly, looking down at him with gentle reassurance. "Don't worry, James. I've traveled plenty of times, and I've never missed a flight. We'll be just fine." As they reached the front of the line, Helen stepped up to the counter, greeted by a young woman who barely glanced up from her screen. "Good afternoon," the clerk said in a monotone voice. "Where are you flying to today?" "To the Caribbean," Helen replied, handing over their passports and tickets. "It's a family vacation." The clerk nodded absent-mindedly, scanning the passports. But then something shifted in her demeanor. Her eyes darted between the documents and Helen, then to Sarah and James. There was a momentary pause, split second, that might have gone unnoticed by someone who hadn't been through this before. But Helen had. Many times. The young woman's professional expression tightened, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Are these your grandchildren?" she asked, her tone now slightly more formal, with an edge of caution. Helen kept her calm, as she always did, even though the question sent a pang of irritation through her. She had been asked this before, more times than she cared to count. "Yes, they're my grandchildren," she answered, her voice steady but firm. "I have all the necessary documentation." The clerk's hesitation became more obvious as she glanced at the passports again, then back at the children. Her brow furrowed. "And the parents she trailed off?" Helen reached into her handbag, pulling out a neatly organized folder with the required travel permissions and birth certificates. "Their mother, my daughter, has given me written permission to take them on this trip," she explained, sliding the documents across the counter. "Everything is in order." The clerk picked up the papers, her face remaining unreadable, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of skepticism. Helen watched her carefully, knowing exactly what was going through her mind. She had seen this look before, the unspoken doubt, the quiet judgment, the underlying question of how a black woman like her could be traveling with 2 white grandchildren. It was a subtle form of prejudice, one that people rarely admitted to, but acted upon nonetheless. Helen had faced it throughout her life, from strangers questioning her authority to colleagues who doubted her abilities. But she had always maintained her composure, knowing that losing her temper wouldn't solve anything. This situation was no different. After what felt like an unnecessarily long pause, the clerk forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for your patience. We'll just need to call security for a routine check." Helen's jaw tightened. Routine check. She knew what that meant. It was code for "we don't believe you." But she said nothing, only nodding as she felt the knot of tension forming in her stomach. She didn't want to alarm the children, who were now growing quieter, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "Grandma, is something wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice small as she reached for Helen's hand. Helen knelt down beside her, giving her a reassuring smile. "Not at all, sweetheart. We're just going to have to wait a little longer, that's all." But inside, Helen was already preparing for what was to come. She had experienced enough moments like this in her life to know when prejudice was at play. She had always handled it with grace, but there was something different this time, something that made her stomach churn with unease. Within minutes, 2 airport security officers arrived. They were tall, imposing figures with stern expressions, their presence adding an extra layer of tension to the moment. Helen gave them a polite nod, trying to keep the situation calm. "Good afternoon," one of the officers said curtly, his eyes sweeping over Helen and the children. "We need to ask you a few questions about your travel plans." Helen stood up, meeting the officer's gaze without wavering. "Of course. Is there a problem, officer?" The taller officer looked down at the documents that the clerk had handed him. "These kids, are they traveling with you?" "Yes," Helen replied, her voice steady but with a hint of frustration creeping in. "They're my grandchildren. We're going on vacation." The second officer, a shorter man with a hard expression, glanced at the documents again. He didn't seem convinced. "We're going to need you to step aside for additional screening." Helen felt the children's grip on her hands tighten. She bent down to reassure them, her voice soft. "Everything's going to be fine, my loves. Stay close to me." But as she stood up and followed the officers to a more secluded area of the airport, a familiar anger began to bubble inside her. She knew what this was. It wasn't about safety or protocol. It was about assumptions made based on the color of her skin and the fact that she was traveling with 2 white children. She had spent her entire career fighting against these kinds of biases, working within the legal system to ensure that justice was served fairly, regardless of race. And yet here she was, subjected to the very prejudice she had fought to eradicate. The additional screening area was small and cramped, with a cold, institutional feel. Helen sat down in the plastic chair provided for her, keeping Sarah and James close by her side. The security officers hovered nearby, speaking in low tones as they reviewed her documents. Helen could hear the soft hum of their voices, but the words were indistinct. "Grandma, why are they asking so many questions?" Sarah whispered, her small hand slipping into Helen's. Helen squeezed her granddaughter's hand gently, her heart aching at the fear she saw in Sarah's eyes. "Sometimes people get confused," she explained quietly. "But everything is going to be just fine." James, ever the more serious of the two, was trying to remain brave, but Helen could see the tension in his face. He was clutching his backpack tightly, his knuckles white. "Are we in trouble?" he asked in a low voice, as if afraid to speak too loudly. "No, sweetheart," Helen said firmly. "We're not in trouble. I've done everything right. It's just a misunderstanding." But as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, something more insidious. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, and for the first time in years, she felt the sharp sting of helplessness. The officers finally approached her, their expressions neutral but stern. One of them, the taller of the two, spoke first. "We're going to need to verify your story," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Can you give us the parents' contact information?" Helen nodded, reaching into her bag for her phone. "Of course. My daughter, Rachel Carter, is their mother. You can call her, she'll confirm everything." She handed over Rachel's phone number, watching as the officer dialed it into his phone. There was a long, tense silence as they waited for the call to connect. Helen could feel her heart pounding in her chest, though she tried to remain calm for the sake of the children. But after several rings, the officer hung up, his expression unchanged. No answer. Helen frowned. Rachel had mentioned that she would be in a meeting today, but she hadn't expected it to interfere with their travel plans. "She's probably still in a meeting," Helen said, trying to keep her voice steady. "If you give her a little time, she'll call back." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "We'll need to confirm this before we let you proceed," he said, his tone colder now. "Until then, we're going to have to hold you for further questioning." Helen's breath caught in her throat. "Hold me, but I've given you all the necessary documentation." The shorter officer folded his arms, his posture rigid. "It's just procedure, Mom. We need to make sure everything checks out. You understand?" Helen understood, all right. She understood that this wasn't about procedure. It was about suspicion, about assumptions made without evidence. It was about the fact that, in their eyes, she didn't fit the mold of what a grandmother should look like. And now, because of those assumptions, her grandchildren were being put through a frightening, unnecessary ordeal. "Can I at least speak to my lawyer?" Helen asked, her voice calm but firm. She had learned long ago that staying composed was the best way to handle situations like this. Losing her temper wouldn't help anyone, not her, not the children, and certainly not her case. The taller officer shrugged. "We'll allow you to make a call once we've finished our review." Helen clenched her jaw but said nothing. There was no point in arguing. Not yet. She would save her energy for when it truly mattered. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Helen sat in the small, uncomfortable chair, keeping her grandchildren close as the officers continued their sockled routine checks. Sarah and James were growing more restless by the minute, and Helen could sense their rising fear. "Grandma," James whispered, his voice trembling slightly, "are they going to take you away?" Helen's heart broke at the question. She reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, James. I'm not going anywhere. I promise." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure if she believed them. The officers returned, their expressions grim. The taller one stepped forward, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "Mom, we've received conflicting information about your travel plans. We're going to need to take you in for further questioning." Helen's blood ran cold. "Further questioning," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've provided everything you've asked for. What more do you need?" The shorter officer, who had remained silent for most of the exchange, stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs in hand. "We're placing you under arrest on suspicion of child abduction." Child abduction. The words hit Helen like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She stared at the officers in disbelief, her mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Child abduction. How had things escalated so quickly, so brutally? "You can't be serious," Helen said, her voice low but filled with anger. "These are my grandchildren. I have the documents to prove it." The taller officer remained unfazed. "We'll need to verify that, ma'am. But for now, we're following procedure." Helen's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You're following procedure by arresting an innocent woman in front of her grandchildren." The shorter officer stepped forward, his face hard. "Turn around, ma'am." Helen glanced down at Sarah and James, who were now clinging to her, their eyes wide with fear. Sarah's bottom lip quivered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Grandma, don't go," she whispered, her voice shaking. Helen knelt down, pulling both children into her arms. "I'm not going anywhere, my loves," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if it was the truth. "Everything is going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel the officers closing in on her, their presence oppressive and unyielding. She knew what was coming. She had seen it too many times before in the news, in her courtroom. Innocent people, wrongly accused, treated like criminals because of the color of their skin. "I'm not a criminal," Helen said, standing tall and looking the officers square in the eye. "And I won't be treated like one." But her words fell on deaf ears. The shorter officer grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back as the cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists. Sarah and James cried out in protest, their small hands reaching for their grandmother as she was pulled away. "Grandma," they screamed. "Don't take her? She didn't do anything." Helen's heart shattered as she was led away, her grandchildren's cries ringing in her ears. But she forced herself to stay calm, to keep walking, even as the humiliation of the situation weighed heavily on her. She had fought for justice her entire life. She had stood up for others, for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. But now, in this moment, she was powerless. And for the first time in years, Helen Carter wasn't sure if justice would prevail. The ride to the police station was a blur for Helen. The flashing lights of the police car, the sounds of the city passing by, the sterile scent of the car's interior, all felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her wrists ached from the tight handcuffs, and her mind raced as she thought about Sarah and James. Were they safe? What was going through their young minds? They had just witnessed their grandmother being arrested, handcuffed, and taken away by police. No child should ever have to go through that. Helen had always believed in the justice system. She had dedicated her life to it after all. She had believed in the rule of law, in fairness, in the idea that justice was blind. But sitting in the back of a police car, hands bound, and treated like a criminal, she realized how blind the system could truly be to the truth. At the police station, Helen was led inside through a side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where people might have seen her. The officers remained silent, doing their jobs with robotic efficiency, but Helen could sense the judgment in their movements, in the way they avoided eye contact with her. They had already decided who she was before they had even asked a single question. The small holding cell where they placed her was cold, with a hard metal bench bolted to the wall and a toilet in the corner. Helen sat down on the bench, staring at the gray walls around her. Her thoughts flickered back to her courtroom, where she had presided over so many cases. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. She had always believed she was making a difference, that her work helped balance the scales of justice. But now, she was just another black woman in a system that often saw people like her as guilty until proven innocent. The door to the cell opened briefly, and a female officer stepped inside, uncuffing her. "You can make a call once we're done processing," the officer said, her voice flat, lacking any warmth or empathy. She then walked out, leaving the door open slightly. Helen's mind raced. Her first thought was to call David Harper, her lawyer and longtime friend. David had been by her side for years, fighting for the rights of the marginalized and wrongfully accused. He would know what to do. He would help her get out of this nightmare. But as she sat there, waiting for the opportunity to make her call, her thoughts drifted back to her grandchildren. They must have been terrified. She hated the idea of them being alone, scared, and unsure of what would happen next. They needed her, and here she was, powerless, sitting in a cold, dark cell, waiting for someone to come to her rescue. Helen had never liked feeling powerless. After what felt like hours, an officer returned to take her down the hallway for processing. They led her to a small room where a tired-looking officer sat behind a desk with a computer. He didn't bother to make small talk as he took her information, asking for her name, date of birth, and other details, as though she were just another name in their long list of people they had processed that day. "Name," the officer asked, his tone devoid of any real interest. "Helen Carter," she answered, her voice steady despite the sinking feeling in her chest. Occupation, he asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard. "I'm a federal judge," Helen said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the officer's reaction. He looked up, his expression skeptical. "A judge?" "Yes," Helen replied, a hint of steel in her voice now. "A federal judge." The officer paused for a moment, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He glanced at the other officers in the room, then back at Helen. "You'll need to verify that," he said, his tone still dismissive, as though he didn't believe her. Helen said nothing, her frustration growing. She had dealt with people like this before, people who assumed things about her based on how she looked or where she came from. But she had never imagined that one day she would be on the receiving end of such treatment, especially after all the years she had spent fighting for justice. Once the paperwork was complete, they allowed her to make her phone call. Helen's hands trembled slightly as she dialed David's number, the coolness of the receiver pressing against her ear. She closed her eyes, willing herself to remain calm, to stay composed. She needed to be strong for herself, for her grandchildren, and for what was to come. After a few rings, David's familiar voice answered on the other end. "David Harper speaking." "David, it's Helen," she said, her voice firm, though a crack of vulnerability seeped through. "I need your help. I've been arrested." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then David's voice came through, sharp and filled with concern. "Helen arrested. What's going on?" "I've been accused of child abduction," Helen explained, the words bitter on her tongue. "They think I kidnapped my own grandchildren." David's tone hardened. "That's outrageous. I'll be there as soon as I can. Don't say anything to anyone else." "Well, handle this." Helen nodded, though she knew he couldn't see her. "Thank you, David. I'll be waiting." She hung up the phone and leaned against the wall, her heart pounding. David would fix this. He had to. But even as she tried to reassure herself, she couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her insides. This wasn't just about getting out of jail. This was about protecting her family, protecting Sarah and James from the trauma of what had happened. She couldn't let them go through this alone. By the time David arrived at the station, the situation had already begun to spiral out of control. Word had spread about Helen's arrest, and it wasn't long before the media caught wind of the story. A federal judge, wrongfully accused of kidnapping her own grandchildren. If ever there was a headline that would catch fire, this was it. Outside the station, a small crowd had begun to gather, reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. The flashing cameras and murmurs of excitement from the crowd made Helen feel like an animal on display. This was the last thing she wanted to become a spectacle, to have her personal life laid bare for the world to see. But she knew it was inevitable. Inside the station, David was already making waves. He had stormed into the precinct with the kind of fury only a seasoned lawyer could summon, demanding to speak to the officers in charge. Helen could hear his voice echoing down the hall, sharp and unrelenting as he laid out his grievances. "She is a federal judge," David was saying, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You've wrongfully detained her without proper cause. I hope you're prepared to explain this in front of a judge, because I guarantee you there will be consequences." When David finally made his way to Helen's holding cell, his expression softened slightly. He was tall and imposing, with a strong jawline and a look of determination that made it clear he wasn't backing down. "Helen," he said, his voice steady now. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Helen replied, though the weariness in her voice betrayed her. "I just want to get out of here." "We'll get you out," David assured her, his voice firm. "But we need to be careful. This is already starting to turn into a media circus, and I'm sure the police are going to try to cover their tracks." Helen sighed. She had hoped this wouldn't turn into a public spectacle, but deep down, she knew it was inevitable. As a federal judge, her name carried weight, and her arrest, no matter how unjust, was newsworthy. But she couldn't let that distract her from the most important thing, getting back to Sarah and James. "What about the kids?" Helen asked, her voice tight with worry. "Where are they?" "They're with Child Protective Services for now," David said, his tone gentle but grim. "We're working on getting them back, but it's going to take some time." Helen's stomach twisted at the thought of her grandchildren being taken into custody by strangers. They must have been terrified. She had promised them she wouldn't go anywhere, and now she had broken that promise. The thought was almost too much to bear. "I need to see them," Helen said, her voice low but resolute. "They need to know I didn't abandon them." David nodded. "We're working on it. But right now, we need to focus on getting you released. Once that's done, we can figure out the rest." Helen knew he was right. As much as she wanted to rush to her grandchildren's side, she needed to be patient. She needed to trust David to handle the legal side of things. But it wasn't easy. David spent the next hour going over the details of the case with the officers in charge, making it clear that this was not just a misunderstanding, it was a gross violation of Helen's rights. He threatened legal action, demanded explanations, and insisted that Helen's credentials as a federal judge be considered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Helen was released from custody. She walked out of the station into the blinding lights of the cameras, trying to shield her eyes from the onslaught of flashes. Reporters swarmed around her, shouting questions, their voices blending together into a cacophony of noise. "Judge Carter, were you wrongfully arrested? Do you plan to sue the police department? What message do you have for the public?" Helen said nothing, her face stoic as she made her way through the crowd with David by her side. There would be time to address the media later. Right now, all she cared about was getting home to her family. But even as she walked away from the station, Helen knew that this was only the beginning. The media firestorm had already started, and there was no turning back now. This story, her story, was going to be everywhere, and she would have to decide how to handle it. By the time Helen arrived back at her daughter's home, the weight of the day's events had begun to settle on her shoulders. The adrenaline that had kept her going throughout the ordeal was fading, leaving behind exhaustion and a dull ache in her chest. But she pushed it aside, knowing that there was still more to face. Rachel and Tom were waiting for her at the door, their expressions a mixture of relief and anxiety. As soon as Rachel saw her mother, she rushed forward, pulling Helen into a tight embrace. "Mom, I'm so sorry," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't believe it when I heard. I tried to call, but they wouldn't let me through." Helen held her daughter close, feeling the warmth of her embrace seep into her. "It's not your fault," Helen murmured. "None of this is your fault." Rachel pulled back, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Where are the kids? Are they okay?" Helen's stomach twisted at the question. "They're with Child Protective Services for now," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. "David is working on getting them released, but it's going to take a little time." Rachel's face crumpled, and she turned away, covering her mouth with her hand as she tried to hold back a sob. Tom stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on his wife's shoulder. "They're going to be okay, Rachel," Tom said softly. "We'll get them back." Helen nodded, though she felt the same gnawing worry that Rachel did. Sarah and James were strong, but they were still children. Being separated from their family, especially under these circumstances, would leave scars that might not heal easily. "He'll make sure they're safe," Helen said, her voice quiet but determined. "He'll do whatever it takes." Rachel wiped her eyes, nodding in agreement. "I know, Mom. I know." In the days that followed Helen's release, the story of her arrest spread like wildfire. News outlets across the country picked up the story, each one adding their own spin to the narrative. Some focused on the fact that Helen was a federal judge, while others zeroed in on the racial profiling aspect of the case. It was a story that resonated with people, touching on the deep-seated issues of race, justice, and the power dynamics between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Helen found herself inundated with calls, messages, and emails from friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Some offered their support, expressing outrage at what had happened to her. Others shared their own stories of mistreatment and injustice, hoping that Helen's case might shine a light on the larger issue. Civil rights organizations quickly rallied behind Helen, using her story as a rallying cry for police reform and accountability. The NAICP, the ACLU, and other advocacy groups reached out, offering legal assistance and media support. It was overwhelming, but it was also heartening. Helen had spent her life fighting for justice, and now, in her time of need, the community was fighting for her. David worked tirelessly behind the scenes, preparing the lawsuit against the police department and airport security. The charges were clear: wrongful arrest, racial profiling, and emotional distress. The case wasn't just about getting justice for Helen, it was about holding the system accountable for its actions. It was about making sure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to anyone else. But as the media attention grew, so did the backlash. There were those who accused Helen of playing the race card, of overreacting to a situation that, in their eyes, was a simple misunderstanding. Online comments and social media posts began to circulate, questioning her credibility and accusing her of seeking attention. Helen tried to ignore the negativity, focusing instead on the overwhelming support she had received from her family, friends, and the community. But it wasn't easy. The constant barrage of media attention and public scrutiny weighed heavily on her. She had always been a private person, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But now her life was being dissected by strangers, her every move analyzed and criticized. One evening, as she sat in her living room with Rachel and Tom, Helen's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen, her heart sinking as she saw yet another news alert about her case. Rachel looked over at her, concern etched on her face. "Mom, you don't have to read all of that. It's just going to stress you out." "I know," Helen said, setting the phone aside. "But I can't help it. This is my life they're talking about." Rachel reached over, placing a comforting hand on her mother's arm. "You don't have to go through this alone. We're all here for you." Helen smiled softly, grateful for her family's support. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Tom cleared his throat, his voice gentle. "We've been thinking, Helen. Maybe it's time to go public with your side of the story. The media is already running wild with speculation. It might be time to set the record straight." Helen considered his words carefully. She had always been hesitant to speak publicly about her personal life, but Tom was right. The media had already taken control of the narrative, and if she didn't speak up, the truth might get lost in the noise. "He'll think about it," Helen said, her mind already racing with possibilities. She knew that going public would mean opening herself up to even more scrutiny, but it might also be the only way to regain control of the situation. As she sat there, surrounded by her family, Helen realized that this was just about her anymore. It was about the larger fight for justice, for accountability, for change. And if she had to step into the spotlight to make that happen, then so be it. Helen sat in David's office, the scent of leather-bound law books and polished wood filling the room. Outside, the noise of the city buzzed in the background, but here, in this space, it was quiet and focused. David was seated across from her, papers spread across his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We have a strong case," David said, looking up from the documents. "The evidence of racial profiling is clear, and we have multiple witnesses who saw how the officers treated you at the airport." Helen nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed down on her shoulders. She had been on the other side of the legal system for so long, overseeing cases, guiding juries, and delivering judgments. Now she was the one fighting for justice, and the irony wasn't lost on her. "Have we heard anything from the police department?" Helen asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "They've lawyered up, as expected," David replied, tapping his pen against the desk. "But their case is weak. They're going to try to frame this as a procedural mistake, but we know it's more than that." Helen clenched her hands in her lap, her mind flashing back to the airport, the suspicious glances, the accusations, the handcuffs. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been a deliberate act of prejudice, one rooted in the color of her skin and the assumptions that came with it. David leaned forward, his gaze serious. "We're not just going after the police department. We're also filing suit against the airport security. They played a key role in this, and they need to be held accountable." Helen sighed, the enormity of the situation weighing on her. "This isn't just about me," she said quietly. "It's about the system. There are so many people who don't have the resources or the platform to fight back. If we win this case, it could set a precedent." David nodded, his expression softening. "You're right. This case is bigger than just you. And that's why we need to be strategic. We need to make sure this doesn't just end with a settlement. We need real change. Helen appreciated David's commitment to the cause. They had been friends for years, and she knew he was one of the few people she could trust to handle this case with the care and determination it deserved. As they continued to go over the details of the lawsuit, Helen couldn't help but feel a growing sense of resolve. This was her fight now, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. She had spent her life upholding the law, and now she would use that same law to demand justice. Helen left David's office feeling the weight of the legal battle that lay ahead. As she drove home, her mind raced with thoughts about what was at stake. This case wasn't just about her wrongful arrest, it had grown into something much bigger. She was now a symbol for others who had experienced similar injustices, and her success could pave the way for systemic reform. But with that knowledge came an enormous responsibility. The media frenzy continued as Helen's story remained front-page news. Civil rights groups threw their full support behind her, and activists around the country used her case to spotlight the urgent need for police accountability and reforms. But Helen knew that the media's attention wouldn't last forever. Public outrage could be fleeting, and there would be new stories tomorrow. She had to act swiftly while the momentum was on her side. Back at home, her daughter Rachel was on the phone, pacing nervously in the kitchen as she spoke with another family friend. Helen watched her for a moment, grateful for the strength and support her family had given her throughout this ordeal. Rachel had been her rock, juggling her own work while handling media requests, coordinating legal paperwork, and caring for Sarah and James. Rachel hung up the phone and turned to her mother, her face lined with exhaustion. That was one of the local news stations. They want an interview, but I told them we're not ready to speak yet. Helen shook her head slightly. Not yet. We need to let David finalize the case and make sure everything's in place before I go public again. It's too soon. Rachel nodded. I understand. It's just I'm worried. This is all so much bigger than we thought it would be. I know you've handled pressure before, but this is different. Helen reached out and touched Rachel's arm, her voice calm but firm. I know it feels overwhelming, but we're doing the right thing. We have to keep pushing forward. The police and the airport security can't get away with this, and we can't let them brush it under the rug. Rachel looked at her mother for a long moment, then sighed. You're right, as usual. Just promise me you'll take care of yourself through all of this. We need you healthy and strong. Helen smiled softly, though the exhaustion tugged at the edges of her expression. I will. Don't worry. As she retreated to her study to go over the legal documents once more, Helen felt the familiar rhythm of preparation kicking in. She had faced daunting challenges before. She had presided over complex trials, made difficult decisions that changed lives, and endured sleepless nights wrestling with the weight of her rulings. But this felt different. This time the stakes were personal. The weeks leading up to the trial were a blur of meetings, preparations, and mounting tension. David had assembled a strong legal team to represent Helen, and they spent long hours combing through every detail of the case. Every document, every witness statement, every piece of evidence had to be airtight. As the day of the trial approached, Helen felt the pressure building. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager to catch a glimpse of the trial's proceedings. The case had drawn national attention, and the courtroom was packed with spectators, legal experts, and activists alike. It was clear that this wasn't just a trial about Helen's wrongful arrest. It had become a symbolic fight for racial justice and police accountability. The defense team, representing both the police department and the airport security, had been working just as hard. They aimed to minimize their client's responsibility, framing the situation as a procedural misunderstanding. Their strategy was clear. They would argue that the officers had simply followed protocol, and that Helen's arrest was an unfortunate but necessary action based on their training. Helen sat in the courtroom on the first day of the trial, her back straight, her eyes focused on the judge overseeing the case. This wasn't her courtroom, but the familiar sights and sounds gave her a sense of calm. She had spent decades in rooms just like this, listening to cases, weighing evidence, and delivering verdicts. Now it was her turn to be heard. David delivered the opening statement with precision and passion, outlining the injustice Helen had suffered and the larger implications of the case. He painted a clear picture of racial profiling, highlighting how Helen had been unfairly targeted based on assumptions about her appearance. "This isn't just about what happened to Judge Carter," David said, his voice steady but forceful. "It's about a system that allows these kinds of assumptions to dictate how law enforcement treats individuals. This case is a clear example of racial bias, and it's time for accountability." The defense team, led by a sharp-tongued lawyer named Eric Donovan, countered with their own argument. Donovan stood before the jury with the confidence of someone who had handled high-profile cases before. His strategy was to downplay the racial aspect of the case, suggesting that the officers were simply doing their job in the face of unclear information. "This case is about public safety," Donovan said, his tone calculated and smooth. "The officers involved acted out of an abundance of caution. There was no malicious intent here. They were following protocol to ensure the safety of the children involved. Let's not lose sight of that." The trial continued for several days, with both sides calling witnesses and presenting evidence. Helen watched as the defense attempted to poke holes in her narrative, suggesting that the officers had no way of knowing whether she was truly the children's grandmother. The defense's argument hinged on the notion that the officers had to act quickly to prevent a potential child abduction, a claim that infuriated Helen. The turning point of the trial came when Helen took the stand to testify. The courtroom fell silent as she approached the witness stand, her posture regal and composed. She had prepared for this moment carefully, knowing that her testimony would be the emotional core of the case. David led her through a series of questions, allowing Helen to recount the events of the day she was arrested. She spoke calmly and clearly, describing how she had provided all the necessary documentation, how she had cooperated fully, and how she had been treated as a criminal in front of her own grandchildren. But when David asked her about the impact the arrest had on Sarah and James, Helen's voice faltered for the first time. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "My grandchildren, they saw me in handcuffs," Helen said, her voice soft but steady. "They were terrified. They didn't understand why their grandmother, who had always been a figure of strength and safety, was being taken away by the police. It's something that will stay with them for the rest of their lives." The courtroom was silent as Helen spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She could see the jurors watching her intently, some of them visibly moved by her testimony. David gave her a small, reassuring nod as she finished speaking, and Helen felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had said everything she needed to say. When the defense cross-examined her, Donovan attempted to undermine her credibility, questioning whether she had truly felt threatened by the officers or if she had overreacted. "Judge Carter," Donovan began, his tone polite but condescending, "you've worked in the legal system for many years. Surely you understand that law enforcement officers have to make quick decisions based on the information they have at the time. Wouldn't you agree that the officers were just doing their jobs?" Helen met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I understand that officers have to make quick decisions. But in this case, they made the wrong decision. I wasn't a threat. I had done nothing wrong. And yet I was treated as if I had." Donovan pressed on, but Helen remained composed, refusing to let him rattle her. She had faced tougher adversaries in the courtroom before, and she wasn't about to back down now. The trial stretched on for nearly 2 weeks, each day bringing new arguments, new evidence, and new emotions. By the time the closing arguments were delivered, Helen felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The outcome of the trial would not only determine her future, but could also set a precedent for similar cases across the country. David's closing argument was powerful and impassioned. He urged the jury to consider the larger implications of the case, reminding them that racial profiling wasn't just an isolated incident, was a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. "This case is about more than just one woman's wrongful arrest," David said, his voice resonating through the courtroom. "It's about the thousands of people who are judged, mistreated, and criminalized because of the color of their skin. It's about standing up for what's right and holding those in power accountable for their actions. The defense's closing argument, delivered by Donovan, was equally forceful. He reiterated the claim that the officers had been acting in the best interests of the children, and that their actions, while unfortunate, were not malicious. The officers didn't know who they were dealing with, Donovan argued. They were presented with a situation that could have been dangerous, and they acted accordingly. This isn't about racial bias, it's about ensuring the safety of children. When the jury was finally dismissed to deliberate, Helen felt the tension in the courtroom shift. This was it. Everything they had worked for over the past few weeks had led to this moment. The jury's decision would determine whether justice would be served. The hours stretched on as the jury deliberated. Helen, David, Rachel, and Tom waited in a small room near the courtroom, the silence thick with anticipation. Every few minutes, Rachel would glance at her phone, as if expecting some news to arrive. Tom sat quietly, his hands clasped in his lap, while David paced the room, his expression unreadable. Helen sat still, her mind racing. She thought about the countless people who had reached out to her during the trial, sharing their own stories of injustice and discrimination. She thought about her grandchildren, who had been through so much because of one moment of prejudice. And she thought about the officers who had arrested her, whether they would ever truly understand the harm they had caused. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a court officer knocked on the door. "The jury has reached a verdict," he said, his voice calm and professional. Helen's heart skipped a beat as she stood up, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would decide everything. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The jury filed in, their faces serious, and the judge asked the foreman to stand. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, his voice echoing through the silent room. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with glasses, nodded. "We have, Your Honor." The judge gestured for her to proceed. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff," the foreman said, her voice clear and strong. "We find that the police department and airport security violated the plaintiff's rights and acted with racial bias in their treatment of her." Helen felt a wave of relief wash over her as the words sank in. They had won. The jury had seen through the defense's arguments and recognized the injustice she had suffered. She glanced at David, who gave her a small, satisfied nod. But the relief was bittersweet. While the verdict was a victory, Helen knew that this was just one step in a much larger fight. The system that had wrongfully arrested her still existed, and there were countless others who would face the same prejudices unless real change was enacted. The jury awarded Helen a significant settlement, and the judge ordered the police department and airport security to implement new training programs to address racial bias. It was a meaningful win, but it was only the beginning of the work that needed to be done. After the trial, Helen returned to her life, but things were different now. The case had changed her not just in how the world saw her, but in how she saw herself. She had always believed in justice, in the power of the law to protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. But now, she understood just how deeply flawed that system could be. At home, Helen sat with her grandchildren, Sarah and James, on the couch. The sun streamed in through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. The children had been through so much, and it would take time for them to fully process everything that had happened. But for now, they were safe, and that was all that mattered. "Grandma," Sarah said softly, looking up at Helen with wide eyes, "are the police going to be nicer now? Are they going to stop being mean to people?" Helen smiled gently, brushing a strand of hair from Sarah's face. "I hope so, sweetheart. We've made a start, but there's still a lot of work to do." James, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, spoke up. "Are you going to keep fighting, Grandma? To make sure no one else goes through what you did?" Helen looked at her grandson, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes, James, I'm going to keep fighting, and I'm going to make sure that what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else." The aftermath of the trial brought a wave of change. The police department and airport security, now under intense public scrutiny, announced a series of reforms aimed at addressing the issues raised during Helen's case. Mandatory bias training for officers, increased oversight, and community engagement programs were implemented in an effort to rebuild trust with the public. Helen, however, knew that these changes, while important, were just the beginning. The systemic issues that led to her wrongful arrest ran deep, and it would take more than a few policy changes to fix them. But she was determined to keep pushing for meaningful reform. With the help of civil rights organizations, Helen began working on new initiatives aimed at addressing racial profiling and police misconduct. She traveled to communities across the country, speaking with activists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens about the need for change. At each stop, she was met with gratitude and admiration, but also with stories of pain and injustice. People shared their own experiences of being wrongfully arrested, harassed, or discriminated against. It was a sobering reminder that while her case had brought attention to the issue, there was still much work to be done. One afternoon, Helen stood before a group of activists at a rally in Washington, D.C. The crowd was diverse, people of all races, ages, and backgrounds, united in their demand for justice. Helen looked out at the faces before her, feeling a sense of solidarity and hope. "This fight isn't over," Helen said, her voice strong and clear. "It won't be over until every person, no matter who they are or where they come from, is treated with dignity and respect. We have the power to make that happen. We just have to keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep standing up for what's right." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. Helen stepped back from the microphone, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This was what she had been fighting for, not just her own justice, but the justice of every person who had been wronged by the system. As the months passed, Helen continued her work, but she also found time to rest and reflect. The trial had taken an emotional toll on her, and she needed to recharge in order to keep going. She spent more time with her family, savoring the quiet moments with Sarah and James, and reconnecting with old friends. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, her daughter Rachel joined her, a cup of tea in hand. "You've done so much, Mom," Rachel said, sitting beside her. "I'm proud of you. We all are." Helen smiled, her heart full. "Thank you, Rachel. It hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it." Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with admiration. "You've made a real difference. People are listening now. Change is happening." Helen looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. "It's a start," she said softly, "but we have to make sure it lasts. This can't be just another moment that fades away. It has to be the beginning of something bigger." Rachel placed a hand on her mother's arm, her voice gentle. "And it will be. Because you won't stop fighting." Helen turned to her daughter, her eyes shining with determination. "No, I won't." Years later, Helen Carter's case would be remembered as a turning point in the fight for racial justice. The reforms she had fought for became models for other cities across the country, and her work continued to inspire new generations of activists and leaders. Sarah and James, now grown, carried their grandmother's legacy with them. They had witnessed firsthand the power of standing up for what was right, and they had learned that justice wasn't something that could be taken for granted. It was something that had to be fought for every day. As they stood at Helen's side at another rally, the two of them looked out at the crowd, their hearts filled with pride. Their grandmother had shown them the way, and now it was their turn to carry the torch. And as Helen looked at her grandchildren, standing tall beside her, she knew that the fight for justice would continue. Because as long as there were people willing to stand up, speak out, and demand change, the world would keep moving forward, one step at a time. As the rally ended and Helen looked out over the crowd, a deep sense of fulfillment settled over her. She knew the fight was far from over, but with each passing day, she felt more certain that change was coming. Thank you for reading Helen's journey and for supporting the fight for justice. If this story moved you, please make sure to subscribe to stay updated on more powerful stories like this one. Click the notification bell to be alerted whenever new stories are shared. And leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from, or share your thoughts on Helen's battle for justice. Together, we can keep the conversation going and work toward making the world a better place. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your voice matters. Let it be heard. These events weren't as formal or high pressure as the town hall had been instead. They were casual gatherings held at local parks and community centers, where people could come together to talk, share their experiences, and find common ground. One of the first events they organized was a coffee with a cop day at a local cafe. Officers from the Colston Police Department, including Parker and Dawson, showed up in plain clothes to talk with community members over coffee and pastries. The atmosphere was initially tense, with many people still harboring distrust and anger toward the police. But as the conversations began, some of those barriers started to come down. "I never realized how scared people were of us," Officer Dawson admitted during one of the conversations. "I thought we were doing our job keeping people safe. But now I see that for some, we were the source of fear, not safety." Danny watched as the officers and residents engaged in difficult but necessary conversations. People shared their stories of being racially profiled, of feeling unsafe in their own neighborhoods, and the officers listened, really listened, for the first time. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension. Some people remained skeptical of the police, unwilling to believe that real change was possible. But for Danny, it felt like progress. Slowly, but surely, they were starting to build a foundation of trust. The events continued over the next few months. Alicia helped organize a community cleanup day where residents and police officers worked side by side to beautify the town. Reverend Adams led a series of workshops on restorative justice, inviting both the police and community members to participate. The workshops focused on healing the wounds that had been caused by years of mistrust and systemic inequality. Danny could see the impact these events were having, both on the community and the police. The officers who had once been defensive and resistant to change were now more open, more willing to listen and learn. And while the community was still cautious, there was a growing sense of hope. Several months after the first town hall, Danny, Alicia, and Reverend Adams decided it was time to hold another large-scale eventone that would bring together all the work they had done over the past few months. This time, they wanted it to be a celebration of the progress that had been made, while also acknowledging that there was still much work to be done. The second town hall was held at the community center, and it drew an even larger crowd than the first. People from all over Colston came, eager to hear about the changes that had taken place and to discuss what more needed to be done. Danny once again took the stage. But this time, he felt more confident, more sure of his role in all of this. "We've come a long way since our first meeting," Danny began, his voice strong and clear. "But we're not done yet. We've started to build bridges, to rebuild the trust that was broken. But real change takes time, and it takes all of us working together, holding each other accountable, and staying committed to justice." The crowd was attentive, and as Danny spoke, he could feel the energy in the room. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the community, about the people who had come together to demand something better for themselves and for future generations. Climax 2 came when Officer Parker stood up to speak. This time she wasn't defensive or dismissive. Instead, she shared her own journey, her realization that she had been part of a system that was broken, and her commitment to being part of the solution. "I used to think that as long as I followed the rules, I was doing my job," Parker said, her voice filled with emotion. "But I've learned that it's not enough to just follow the rules. We have to question the rules. We have to be willing to change them when they're wrong. And I'm committed to doing that from the inside out." The room was silent for a moment, and then a wave of applause broke out. It was a powerful momentone that signaled a shift not just for Parker, but for the entire town. After the second town hall, the momentum continued to build. Danny, Alicia, and Reverend Adams worked with Captain McCullough and other leaders in the police department to push for concrete policy changes that would address the issues of racial profiling and systemic bias. One of the first victories came when the police department agreed to implement body cameras for all officers, a move that would increase transparency and accountability. They also began working on a new de-escalation training program, designed to reduce the number of violent encounters between the police and residents. But the fight wasn't over. Danny knew that real change wouldn't happen with a few policy shifts. It would take years of hard work, of staying vigilant and holding the police accountable. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. But for the first time, Danny felt like they were moving in the right direction. As the months passed, Danny found himself reflecting on his journey. What had started as a traumatic experience, his wrongful arrest had turned into something much bigger. He had been forced to confront his father's legacy, to step into a role he had never imagined for himself. But through it all, Danny had grown. He had learned that he didn't have to be his father to make a difference. He had found his own voice, his own way of leading. And while the weight of his father's legacy still hung over him, it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a gift, something he could carry with him as he continued to fight for justice. Danny also found a sense of balance in his life. He had thrown himself into the fight for change, but he knew that he couldn't let it consume him. His mother, Grace, had been his rock throughout it all, reminding him to take care of himself and to remember the things that brought him peace. In the quiet moments, Danny found solace in his family, in his friends, and in the small, everyday acts of kindness that had always been a part of his life. He had learned that change didn't always come in the form of grand gestures. It often came in the small, quiet moments that made up a life. Around him, the courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. The event is held at the same community center where the second town hall took place, but this time the mood is light and celebratory. Families gather, children play, and the air is filled with laughter and music. It's a stark contrast to the tension and anger that had filled the room during the first town hall. There's still work to be done. Danny knows that, but today is a day to celebrate the victories they've won. As Danny stands at the edge of the crowd, watching people mingle and laugh, he feels a deep sense of peace. He has found his place in this fight, his own way of carrying forward his father's legacy. And though the road ahead will be long, he knows that he's not walking it alone. Alicia and Reverend Adams join him, their faces glowing with pride. "We've done good work, Danny," Alicia says, smiling. "But this is just the beginning." Danny nods, feeling a surge of hope. Yeah, just the beginning. As the event continues, Danny looks around at the people he has come to know and love, the people who have stood with him through the hardest year of his life. And for the first time in a long while, he feels hopeful about the future. As the community event continued, Danny smiled, reflecting on the incredible journey he had been on. From the moment of his wrongful arrest to standing at the forefront of meaningful change, he had grown in ways he never expected. Now, he was filled with hope for the future, not just for himself, but for his entire community. This story is one of healing, growth, and the power of unity. It shows us that change is possible, even in the face of adversity, and that each of us has a role to play in building a better world. Sean, I've been talking to some people in the civil rights community, and there's a real opportunity here. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have responded like Danny did? How do you think communities can work together for change? I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay hopeful, stay kind, and let's continue to make the world a better place, one story at a time. Sean was silent for a moment, considering Ethan's words. He had been so focused on winning the trial that he hadn't thought much about what would come next. But now that the dust was settling, he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. His fight for justice had resonated with people all over the country, and he had the chance to make a real difference. "I'm in," Sean said, his voice steady. "I just wanted you to know that. We'll work together on this. There's a long road ahead, but I think we can really make an impact." Sean hung up the phone, a sense of purpose settling over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something much larger, a future where no one would have to endure what he had gone through. If you've enjoyed this story and want to follow along with more inspiring and powerful content, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated. Your support helps us bring these important stories to life and keeps the conversation going. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thanks for being part of this journey. Thank you all for being here today, Ethan began, his voice steady and strong. This center represents more than just a building. It represents a commitment to standing together, to supporting each other, and to fighting for the rights of those who have served this country, regardless of their background. The crowd applauded, the energy in the room warm and uplifting. We've all faced challenges, Ethan continued, but those challenges don't define us. What defines us is how we respond to them, how we lift each other up, and how we keep pushing for a better future. As Ethan finished his speech, the crowd erupted into applause. He stepped down from the podium, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The investigation had come to an end, and many of the people involved had been brought to justice. Sophia hugged him tightly, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she whispered. Ethan smiled, holding her close. "We did it." In the months that followed, Ethan and Sophia continued to grow their involvement in the community. The new center became a hub for veterans and families, a place where people could come together to share their stories, find support, and work toward solutions. Ryan Carter, meanwhile, had fully committed to his new role within the department, working to address bias and promote better community relations. It wasn't always easy, and he faced resistance from some of his fellow officers, but he knew that the work was important. One day, as Ryan was leaving a meeting at the department, he ran into Ethan in the hallway. The two men exchanged a brief glance, and for a moment there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the journey they had both been on. Ethan nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. Ryan returned the nod, a silent agreement that while they couldn't change the past, they were both working toward a better future. As they went their separate ways, both men felt a sense of resolution, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but that they were walking it in the right direction. The sun was setting on a warm evening as Ethan and Sophia sat on their porch, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. The world around them was still filled with challenges, but they had found their place in it, standing together, fighting for justice, and building something better for the next generation. As they sat in comfortable silence, Sophia reached over and took Ethan's hand. "We've come a long way," she said softly. Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "And we've still got a long way to go." Sophia nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. "But we'll get there." Together, they watched the sun dip below the horizon, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side, ready for whatever battles the future might bring. If you enjoyed this story and would love to hear more like it, filled with powerful lessons, compelling characters, and deep emotional journeys, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join our community as we continue to share meaningful stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more. We're committed to bringing you stories that explore important issues, from justice to resilience and everything in between. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take on the themes explored in this story. Together, we can keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and well, see you in the next video. Silver Creek was changing, and so were they. A few weeks later, the community held a town-wide celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event, organized by Nia and Martha Sullivan, was a way to bring everyone together, to celebrate the town's journey toward inclusion and justice. The celebration was held in the town square, where people from all walks of life gathered, young and old, black and white, conservative and progressive. It was a symbol of how far Silver Creek had come, and a reminder that the town's future was something everyone could help shape. As the sun set over the square, Ethan and Nia stood together on the main stage, looking out at the crowd. The atmosphere was warm and joyful, filled with laughter and music. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the power of love, community, and perseverance. Martha Sullivan took the microphone, her voice carrying across the square. "Tonight, we're celebrating more than just the progress we've made. We're celebrating the people who made that progress possible. People like Ethan and Nia, who showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The crowd erupted in applause, and Nia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't done this for recognition, but hearing the town come together in support of the changes they had fought for filled her with a sense of pride and fulfillment. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nia danced together under the stars, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. The future, once uncertain, now felt bright with possibility. And though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they would face them together, just as they always had. As the years passed, Silver Creek continued to evolve, becoming a beacon of hope for other towns grappling with the same struggles. Ethan and Nia's love story became part of the town's legacy, a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to back down in the face of adversity. Their journey wasn't just about love. It was about standing up for justice, for fairness, and for the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. In the end, Silver Creek had become a place where people from all walks of life could live, love, and grow. And though the road had been long and hard, it had been worth every step. Ethan and Nia, together, had built a legacy of love and hope, one that would endure for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about love, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest content. Thanks for your support, and remember, love and justice always prevail. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a beautiful day, full of possibility. And as Derek looked out, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future, not just for himself and his family, but for the world they were all helping to shape. Mia and Marcus ran into the room, their laughter filling the air as they played a game of tag around the furniture. Jessica followed close behind, her smile bright and warm. Derek turned away from the window and watched his family, feeling a deep sense of contentment. They were his reason for everything, for standing tall in the face of adversity, for sharing his story, for doing his part to make the world a better place. And as he looked at their faces, full of love and laughter, Derek knew that the future was bright. It wouldn't always be easy, but it was full of potential, full of opportunities to learn, to grow, and to create a world where empathy and understanding prevailed. In the end, that was all he could ask for. As the day wound down, Derek sat back at his desk, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the last few months. From the confrontation at the electronics store to the inspiring conversations with young people, he had witnessed firsthand how one small action could create lasting change. Every step forward mattered. He logged into his blog and drafted another post, this time focusing on the idea of speaking out, of standing up for what's right. He knew there was more work to do, always more people to reach, more stories to tell. But he felt confident that he was on the right path. As Derek prepared to hit publish, he paused, thinking of everyone who had been following his journey. If you've been inspired by this story and want to be part of a community that stands up for empathy, justice, and change, don't forget to subscribe to the blog. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories about making a difference one step at a time. Together we can build a future that's brighter for everyone. Satisfied, Derek hit the publish button and leaned back in his chair. The work wasn't done, but with every new subscriber, every person who read and connected with his message, he knew they were getting closer to the world they all deserved. And that was worth everything.